Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Greed is ubiquitous in the world in which we live today. Pure and total greed. I can still remember when I was a kid watching cigarette commercials on television. The tunes from those commercials sometimes will ring in my head. I can picture the actors, the Marlboro Man in those commercials, Benson and Hedges, and so on and so on. Meanwhile, I know that my own parents, unlike their friends, quit smoking together right before I was born. Why? Because they believed the warnings put out by the American Cancer Society that not only smoking, but secondhand smoke could cause cancer. And based upon that, they decided together to quit smoking. Their friends did not. In fact, their friends would sometimes tease my parents over the fact that they were the only people who would visit their homes and would not smoke. Most people smoked when I was growing up. It was the odd bird that did not. I remember going to school. There were ashtrays on the tables, the desks of professors. When I was a college student, the ashtrays were on the desks of students, and a significant number of students smoked as well. Smoking was basically expected, and the person who did not smoke was seen as being odd. What's wrong with you? Why don't you smoke cigarettes? People who believed in the warnings put out by the American Cancer Society were frequently called conspiracy theorists. Now, I am one of the major critics of legitimate conspiracy theories, but scientific consensus is not a conspiracy theory. And there was a scientific consensus surrounding smoking and secondhand smoke. But because of the power of the tobacco companies, they suppressed it. They denied it. They paid off members of Congress not to conduct hearings. How? By becoming their campaign contributors. And so years and years and years went on. People were literally consuming poison, totally unaware of what they were doing, totally unaware. I recall this one TV show. I forget the name of the show, and I forget the name of the actress that was in this particular episode, but it was a game show. The woman who was a guest on the show later played the part of the maid on the Brady Bunch TV series, if you recall who she was. This show was made, I think, about 10 years before the Brady Bunch started. After her particular segment on the show ended, the host of the show offered her a carton. I believe it was Winston, but I could be wrong about that. A carton of Winston cigarettes. Everyone, whether celebrity or not, was given a carton of Winston cigarettes. And her response? I'm not going to take those cancer sticks. She was a brave soul. She stood up to the advertiser. Now, she was a smart woman. She knew that the advertiser was Winston, but she didn't care. Obviously, she didn't care. So what did the host say? Well, again, oh, come on. That's a conspiracy theory. Cigarettes are not harmful. And she just stormed off the set. It was an extremely humorous incident. Why? Because when I saw that particular episode of the show, it was only about 20 years ago. It was a rerun on the Game Show Network, now called GSN in the United States. Sadly, the host of that show and all the panelists were all celebrities, all died of cancer-related causes, whether lung cancer or emphysema. It killed all of them. And they all got it, I assume, believing sincerely that cigarettes were harmless. Totally harmless. And yet it was killing them without them even knowing it. And think about their children in their homes, exposed for much of the day to their parents smoking cigarettes. And then when they grew up, they began smoking cigarettes too. What was the biggest predictor of a person becoming a tobacco addict? I guess addict would be the right word, since it's a substance. It is whether one's parents smoked cigarettes. So my parents did not smoke cigarettes, and consequently, I never smoked cigarettes either. Most people I knew did. Now, I've lost touch with the majority of those people, and I have no idea what's become of them, whether any of them got lung cancer, emphysema. I'm sure some of them did, but I don't know what percentage. Pure and total greed. So, what happened? Well, there was a memo that got released accidentally from a tobacco company, which revealed that that tobacco company and others were totally aware of the harm caused by cigarettes, and they suppressed the information. But it got out, and it reached the public. And pretty soon, in the early days of C-SPAN, there were hearings held by Congress. I watched many of them. The presidents of tobacco companies were grilled by these hypocritical members of Congress. That's all I could think of them as, because they must have known. They must have known. At least many of them must have known. But they were, again, literally paid off by the tobacco companies to keep quiet. And yet they scorned these presidents of tobacco companies. What could they do? They apologized. I mean, they couldn't do anything more than that. I consider them to have been mass murderers. Mass murderers. I don't see how that term could be denied for them. They were literally mass murderers. But the average person, the average consumer, had no idea that they were the victims of a mass murderer, a tobacco company. So, what happened? Well, tobacco companies were required to print warning labels on cigarette boxes. Many tobacco companies were required to make public service announcements advising people not to smoke, even while they continued to advertise cigarettes in newspapers and magazines. They couldn't do it on TV anymore. That was off territory, but in newspapers, in magazines, yeah. And they still did it on billboards, yeah. And they still did it. So they lost a lot of money. There were class action lawsuits against many of these tobacco companies. They lost billions of dollars. Where are those companies now? They are riding in the money. They are riding in the money. I don't know how much of an impact in the long term those hearings and those court decisions had on those companies, but clearly it did not destroy them, and it should have destroyed them, but it did not. And so we see an example of how capitalism literally killed people, not just metaphorically. And often when I speak about the damage that capitalism is doing and the way in which capitalism is killing our world, I am using killing in a metaphorical sense. But when it comes to what the tobacco companies did and are still doing, they were literally and still are literally killing people. There's no doubt about that. And selling cigarettes, selling cigars, selling pipe tobacco is still perfectly legal in the United States. And so they continue to get away with it. Some cigarette companies were required to open up rehabilitation centers to help cigarette smokers quit smoking. Total hypocrisy. They were trying to get smokers to quit smoking, even as they were continuing to sell cigarettes. Did it make any sense? Of course not. But capitalism makes no sense. Greed makes no sense. From the standpoint of Roy Bhaskar's critical realism, greed is an example of pure demi-reality, or Maya illusion, or disunity, or as Roy sometimes called it, splitting. Splitting. Who was split? Society was split. People were split. People's lives were split apart and destroyed by these tobacco companies. Now, a similar phenomenon is occurring. But it's not with cigarettes, it's with global warming, or as it's sometimes called, climate change. I guess that's a more appropriate term because climate change sometimes results in global warming and sometimes results in global cooling. So I guess climate change is a more appropriate term. Still, that term, climate change, just sounds too lukewarm to me. It does not really bring the issue as close to home as I feel it should bring it. But nevertheless, who cares? That's just my own reaction to it. When we look at what these companies are doing, manufacturing cars that pollute the atmosphere, killing the atmosphere without any care in the world. Countries like India, in one way, understandably, are arguing, why should we stop polluting the environment? You, meaning the first world, made money by doing precisely what we are doing now. So who are you to tell us to stop polluting the environment? Are they right? Factually, yeah. Factually, they are right. Factually, what they are saying is accurate. But what that shows is that that same first world mentality, that same mentality of a lack of concern for our fellow humans, has sadly left the first world and entered into the third world. Even the third world has been contaminated by the capitalist world system. The problem with the capitalist world system is that even though it is dominated and run by the first world, its effects are not limited to the first world. Its effects are ubiquitous. They are global. They affect all of us. And so people in many countries around the world, many developing countries, have to wear masks as they wander down the streets because of the immense pollution in their cities. And that's true in many developed countries as well, like parts of Japan and China. So it's a tragedy. It is a tragedy which we have created for ourselves, just like we created the tragedy caused by tobacco and nicotine. So, what are we doing about it? Not much, not much. Deadline after deadline after deadline passes by, and still there is no real change. Still, we see the continuation of climate change or global warming. Nothing really has changed. Nothing. If anything, it is getting worse. The prediction is, and this has partially been fulfilled already, that many islands, particularly in the South Pacific, will within the next few decades simply be gone. That has already started to happen. People on some islands have had to literally abandon them. These are indigenous people of islands that, because of global warming, have been forced to flee to other places, like New Zealand and Australia. They have fled because they had no choice. They didn't want to flee. Who wants to leave their home? Very few people. People generally will only leave their homes when they have to. But when your home, when your island simply cannot support you, what else are you going to do? So again, as with cigarettes, capitalism is literally killing people. There are predictions that by the end of the current century, the 21st century, the Florida Peninsula will no longer exist. It will be totally submerged into the ocean. And thus, the Gulf of Mexico will be a thing of the past. The Gulf of Mexico will simply become a part of the Atlantic Ocean. Even now, when people travel or fly over Antarctica, people can see ruins of civilizations in the past before the Ice Age. Before the Ice Age. So, global warming, climate change has led glaciers to melt, to leave Antarctica and the Arctic. And what are they doing? They are elevating the seas. And as those seas become elevated, the water has to go somewhere. So where does it go? It covers continents, it covers peninsulas, and it covers islands. So that is what is happening right now. An example of the greed of capitalism and how it is affecting literally all of us. Doesn't matter where you live, what part of the world in which you reside, you are being affected by the greed of capitalism. First by tobacco and nicotine, and now by air pollution and other forms of pollution. And here's an interesting aside. Many of the law firms that defended the tobacco companies are now the same ones defending the polluters, defending the oil companies, the same law firms, exactly the same law firms. It is an evil deed. It is one that we, as a humanity, have agency over, but we have chosen collectively not to use it. I mean, as an individual, I would use it. I would, but how can I? I mean, if I could clone people like Al Gore, make him into a commodity in a sense, have him all over the world, Al Gore's all over the world, I would do it. Al Gore is not a perfect man. He is imperfect, like me. He is, as far as I know, also not a Marxist, but at least he cares. He cares about the earth, and he cares about our survival. Now, we can talk about having communism or socialism and revolutions leading to them in different parts of the third world. We can talk about them until we are blue in the face. But if we destroy our planet, the only planet that we have access to, all of that will simply come to naught. We don't have another planet to go to. We can't escape to Mars, to Jupiter, or as in science fiction novels, to some other dimension. Here is where we are, and here is where we may die. So when I've said in the past that I'm a pessimist and a cynic, that is partially the reason why. Although I believe that if there are revolutions, that initially at least, they will be in the third world, not in the first world, because the third world has revolutionary potential. It is oppressed. The first world may have some, but not enough. But if we destroy ourselves, whether through climate change or through nuclear wars or whatever, then none of that will matter. None of it will matter. All that we are doing will have been a total waste of time. The journey of humanity from prehistoric times until the present will simply come to an end. And that is what I fear. I'm sorry for being so negative. I realize this is not the most positive thing to talk about, but I am not an idealist. I am a realist, a critical realist. And being a critical realist means that I need to look at the world as it is right now, not as I want it to be. And the world as it is right now is not very good. It is not very promising. And so, although I certainly hope that we make a change in course, I hope that we stop the process of climate change. I hope that we do not extinguish ourselves through nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. There are no guarantees. In fact, If I were to look at it objectively, I would say that the odds are that we will end up destroying ourselves. That appears to me to be the direction in which our planet is moving. Can we change it? I don't know. Maybe. Again, we've passed so many deadlines. People on the right will commonly say, see, we passed another deadline and we're still here, totally misunderstanding what those deadlines are. They are deadlines for changing course. They are not deadlines for destruction. The fact that we are still here simply means that we have not reached the culmination of the process that we are in. It doesn't mean that we have simply saved ourselves from the consequences of our own actions. And so with each deadline that we pass, it becomes less and less unclear. I should say less and less clear that we will end up surviving long enough to have socialist or communist revolutions in the third world. I hope I am wrong. I hope the scientists are wrong, but evidence does not lie. The fact that islands have already been removed from the face of the map, the fact that there are continuing consequences to global warming, rising rates of cancer, and other horrendous diseases, tells us that we have not reached our reckoning. We have not reached our reckoning. We have not made a decision to go in the right direction. Instead, we are continuing down the path which may, if we continue it, lead inevitably to our own complete destruction. And so I made this podcast as a way of talking about a practical way or practical ways in which capitalism has literally been killing us. First, through cigarettes. Second, through climate change, with the same attorneys defending the companies involved in both. And that's a tragedy, and one which we may or may not survive. For the time being, this has been Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.